and thought-provoking panel this morning, which is dealing more with methodology and conceptualization and broader themes. We are now in the contemporary perspectives on the status of religious minorities, particularly post-Arab Spring. This is the panel where we get a little more specific and where we're concentrating more on contemporary issues. You have biographies available, so I won't spend time on that, except to say that we have a distinguished panel, and we will go in the order in the handout that was listed. We will start with Professor Son, who is the William Kennan Distinguished Professor of Humanities in the College of William and Mary, and is a prominent scholar in a variety of areas of modern Islamic studies. We have His Excellency Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, who is the South Africa's ambassador to the United States and who has long been active in Islamic affairs as well as general South African affairs, and Qamar al-Huda, who is the Senior Program Officer in the Religion and Peacemaking Center at the USIP. I will have a chance to finish off with a few comments, so I will stop now and give you the pleasure of Tamara.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the ACMCU and to ISNA for organizing this important conference. It's great fun to meet up with I've just been meeting up with some friends who have been involved in interfaith things that have been going on since I was just reminded grade school with Vatican II, when we followed it day by day, and then right into high school, and then right through university. So I'm now meeting up with some people from that era, and then also with my esteemed colleague, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, with whom I did a conference, and John Voll as well, and John Esposito in 1994 on Muslim contributions to civil society in South Africa. And where's John Borelli? John Borelli just said 1994 seems like just yesterday. Not to me. So much has happened since then. He's now Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, which is wonderful. So we're very, very excited to be here and share these important ideas and developments with you. A lot has changed. We're all familiar with the early Islamist discourse that advocates for an Islamic state, and in that context assigns secondary status to non-Muslim minorities. In this view, all law comes from God, and only God can legislate. The state's role is therefore only to implement revealed law, and only properly, that is, traditionally trained legal scholars, fuqaha, may determine the best way to implement God's law, God's revealed law. Non-Muslims' essential human rights are preserved, the traditional rights to life, family, property, reason, and religion, but they are not to be put in legislative positions. Maududi, of course, was an early proponent of this approach, as were major ideologues from the early Muslim Brotherhood. Opponents of this view insist on the distinction between executive and legal spheres of Islam, a much more refined approach to the question of rights of minorities. From their perspective, which is well grounded in classical fiqh, Islam actually requires no particular political system, only that for any political system to be considered legitimate, its laws must be consistent with Islam, with Islamic values, law based on Islamic sources. Governments themselves are not based on the sources. They're quite separate. Therefore, religious identity should have no impact on political participation. It's not surprising, of course, to find Muslims who live in non-Muslim majority societies to be advocating this newer approach. Egyptian-American Khaled Abdel Fadl, for example, insists that Islamic tradition is pluralistic and incorporates a number of concepts comparable to those of modern democracies. In addition to the need for a consultative government, he says, early Muslim jurists agreed on the notion that government exists by contract between the ruler and the ruled. There were differences among the fuqaha about the status of that contract, but they agree that there must be popular approval of government in some form. As well, Abul Fadl says government must be participatory. He acknowledges that some Muslims reject the idea of democracy on the basis of the idea that only God can rule, but Abul Fadl argues that this is a fatal fiction, indefensible, he says, from the point of view of Islamic theology, because it assumes that some human beings have perfect access to the divine will. He says that no human being or group of human beings can claim to have direct access to the divine will other than through the guidance of revelation. As perfect a guide as the Quran is, it does not regulate everything that human beings will ever do. It gives guidance for all aspects of life, but specific rulings in specific contexts, aside from basic regulations presented in Revelation, specific rulings are left to human beings to extract, guided by the Quran's principles. Abul Fadl claims that an Islamic government in the world today protects the basic human rights, again, those identified as the maqasid al-sharia, but traditional interpretations of those rights are not always tenable in today's world. He says that the means of protecting those rights must be reanalyzed in light of current diversity of human experience. European scholar Tariq Ramadan addresses the issue from a different direction, but he again makes use of the maqasid al-sharia and includes freedom of conscience and expression, extending the traditional list of the maqasid, or the objectives of sharia. And of course, this is based on Quranic sources and prophetic precedent. Ramadan says that people must have the right to choose their leaders, express their opinions, and live, male and female, Muslim and non-Muslim, under equal protection of the law, as was the case in the Prophet's time. So those are views of Muslims living as Muslims in non-Muslim majority countries. But I want to focus today on Muslims living in majority countries, especially those involved in the current democratic revolutions, because they're having to go from ideals, go beyond ideals, to actually putting into legal structures those ideals. Now, despite the newsworthy rejections of non-Muslims equals citizenship made by some early Islamists, and we can still find, they're usually picked out by the media immediately and put on the front page, but there are still a few voices who say no, non-Muslims won't have equal status with Muslims in the new democracies. But contrary to those opinions, the majority of mainstream Islamic thinkers today reject that exclusivism and include full equality for Muslims and non-Muslims living in Islamic governments. And this is not a new trend. I want to stress that this has been a trend developing over the past 20 years. Back in 1982, for example, Egypt's Tariq al-Bishri addressed the issue in a book about Muslims and Copts sharing a national identity. In 2005, he did a book on national identities. Now, granted, neither one of these books was accepted wholeheartedly by the Copts because al-Bishri still insisted on describing Egypt as a Muslim country. But still, within that context, he argues that being a Muslim country is good for minorities because Islamic law guarantees equal rights for non-Muslims. And he wasn't speaking of the Zimmi status that was mentioned before, but rather he insisted on that in a modern Islamic state where authority is institutional rather than personal, that is, the authority is in the institution of the state rather than in the ruler, then non-Muslims can hold any office in the state. Kamal Abu Magid as well, in 1988, another Egyptian activist, argued for equal rights for all citizens. And there, he was distinguishing between political and legal spheres. As I noted above, from this perspective, while Islamic law is rooted in Islamic sources, governments are not. Abu Magid says, Islamic government is a civil, not a religious government. Therefore, religious identity has no bearing on participation in the political process. Egypt's very well-known legal scholar Salim al-Awa agrees, not only is government a civil matter, with authority resting in the people whose right it is to choose, but all citizens have equal rights to choose, women and non-Muslims included. Sometimes people forget they're citizens as well. In governments that conflate executive and legislative branches, women and non-Muslims were traditionally excluded, based on the belief that neither should have the right to rule over Muslim men. Al-Awa says that when the distinction between executive and legislative spheres is recognized, along with the distinction between the divine sources of Islamic law and the practical codes on which they're based, then it becomes clear that all citizens share equally the rights and responsibilities of democratic governance. I'm quoting him. He says, the only permissible distinction between candidates is according to ethics, character, public record, and ability to support what is right and deter what is wrong. Egypt's Fahmi Hawadi has been among the most assertive on this issue, addressing the status of non-Muslims living in Muslim-majority countries. 1985, he wrote a book on, citizenship and Zimmiyun, being a Zimmi. He insisted that in non-Muslims, even in classical times, people who have the rights of religion, property, family, reason, etc., but still that Zimmi status is obsolete. He calls on, actually in this 1985 book, he calls on Martin Luther as an authority to support his assertion that in the classical era, 16th century, he says, even Luther recognized that Zimmi status at that time was progressive. I'm quoting, the Ottoman Empire enjoyed an aura of magnanimity, and Martin Luther reiterated this idea in his book, in which he warned that the poor of Europe prefer to live under the protection of the Turks instead of the Christians. He was criticizing the dominant Christian structure, of course, at the time. Hawadi also says, and I'm quoting, Muslims have ruled no land in which they have not preserved within it what existed of religion and minorities. This is a result of the Muslims honoring human being as a human being, no matter what his or her beliefs, color, or gender were. So the fact that Islam teaches that human beings in general, not just Muslims, were created as God's stewards entails that all human beings have equal rights in the sight of their Creator. I want to move on, because I already got the time sign, to his 1993 book, Islamu Demokratia, in which he stressed the same thing, and in 2006, another work. But I'm moving on now to Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is, of course, mainstream thinker, probably the best known of Muslim activists and spokespeople today, who argues in favor of democracy, but he says it must be real democracy, not just democracy by name only. And it has to be, and it's in that context that he discusses the rights of minorities. In 2002, he said, in modern terminology, dhimmis are citizens in an Islamic state, and then he goes through the preservation of rights for them. But now, in his most recent work, In 2010, The Nation and Citizenship, Watan wa Wataniya, he analyzes the question in terms of maqasid al-sharia, and instead of going back to classical fiqh of zimmi, he goes back to, as we've heard earlier discussed, the Constitution of Medina. Then he looks at the notion of ummah within that constitution, and here's where the major contribution that Qaradawi makes in this most recent work is, he rethinks the notion of ummah and says that it's not, as it has traditionally been considered, equivalent with religious identity, but instead communal identity. It can be political, it can be geographic, it can be social, and all people have multiple identities. They can belong at the same time to multiple communities, and those aren't mutually exclusive. So that in Egypt today, what we belong to as Egyptians, he says, is the Egyptian community, regardless of religious, ethnic, communal, or gender identity. We share a brotherhood, by which he meant sisterhood, in which all people share the rights of the maqasid al-sharia, extended to rights of freedom of speech, association, and conscience. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I want to greet all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good morning.
Good morning.
I have been honored to be in the company of people like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayah, Jamal Badawi, Professor Son, and all the illustrious guests here. I'm relieved that Sheikh Abdullah has departed, but anxious that people like Jamal Badawi are still here, because the fiqh provision, وَمَنْ مَعْ بَطَلَ تَيَمُّمْ, that when there is water, then tayammum, the usage of dust, becomes unnecessary. And so I stand here as dust to the water that is around me. I think that I'm asked to speak here as a South African, as a member of a small minority, and by minority I'm not going to get into the intellectual gymnastics. It's about a community who is smaller than the community around them, and therefore get through stresses and strains as a result of being smaller, and have additional hardships and sometimes additional responsibilities within a nation that contains communities which are larger than them. So if you can understand all of that, then you understand my usage of the term minority. Who are the Muslims of South Africa? It's a minority. Sometimes we call ourselves 3% of the population, but often that is for the purpose of Hajj quotas. We may be smaller than that. The question that everyone would ask is, how did a community that is less than 1 million people in South Africa produce anti-apartheid warriors who went to jail with Nelson Mandela, who were exiled with the leaders of the ANC, who were tortured to death like Imam Abdullah Harun, who got thrown out of 10-story buildings like Ahmad Timol, together with the equivalents in the communist ideology, in the nationalist ideology, in the liberation movement. People would ask, how is it that this small community, that when Nelson Mandela announced his first cabinet in that tremendous year 1994, that 9 of the cabinet ministers were members from the Muslim community, that his first Minister of Justice was a Muslim, his first Chief Justice was a Muslim, the second Auditor General was a Muslim, and that someone like myself, coming from a small community, could be elected as the governor of arguably one of the most beautiful provinces anywhere in the world, the Western Cape. How did Muslims snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Because Muslims have the penchant globally for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Here was a community who came there as slaves and political exiles from the Malayan archipelago, slaves to work for the Dutch, exiles to quell the uprisings in places like Indonesia, and were brought to South Africa in that condition. Their religion completely banned. If you were caught practicing your salah, your prayers, or any other rituals in Islam, you lost either your freedom, your property, or your life. Up till 1990, when my only daughter was born, I had to register her as illegitimate because Muslim marriages were not recognized. That's the extent of Islamophobia that existed throughout the period of Muslim existence in South Africa. I raise that simply to say that when, as a minority, we establish ourselves in South Africa, we do it without the silver spoon in our mouths. We did it because we have suffered as enormously as what that, and probably, I was saying to Professor Badawi, when time is short, elegance leaves your speech. And so the key insight that we emerged with at the moment of Nelson Mandela becoming president of South Africa, apartheid being banished, the key insight we learned was that what you demand as a minority, you've got to give when you are a majority. If you cannot give when you are a majority, can you demand when you are a minority? And that's the fundamental challenge around which the debate today must rotate. That's the test of integrity when we fight Islamophobia, where we are a minority, and that's the test of integrity when we speak to our Muslims, our fellow Muslims, when they are a majority. Can you give to your minorities what we demand as a minority in the West? If we cannot answer that question with fundamental integrity, then I think we are setting for ourselves a continuous battle and struggle, because we understood in South Africa, and this begins to answer why it is that Muslims rose to these positions and enjoy full and equal rights, to the extent that the South African Bill of Rights today declares all religions are equal. Because it does not say how many are you and therefore how equal are you. If you recognize the equal value of that person's conception of God, of a divinity, then you begin to understand that you cannot create equal or equal status between people. And that becomes the second major challenge. And it is in understanding that we begin then to say, how did we achieve this? And again, I want to say that our achievement of this status in South Africa, despite our numbers, is because we understood a fundamental principle of seerah, not simply cherry-picking our way through verses of the Quran or sayings of the Prophet, but understanding fundamentally that before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Rasulullah, the messenger of God, he was Al-Amin, the trustworthy. You cannot be Rasulullah, the messenger of God, without first being Al-Amin, the trustworthy. If you enter a situation with a deficit of trust, whatever brilliance there may be and truth there may be in your message, the deficit of trust always subtracts from the message. And Muslims had earned the al-aminness their trustworthiness, because they were prepared to die with the majority, to go to jail with the majority, to be exiled with the majority, and to take the hard knocks with the majority. And unless one is able to do that, one enters any relationship. You can do any semantics with tafsir, with taqweel, with anything. When you have the deficit of trust, the most brilliant analysis and interpretation will not explain to people what it is that you stand for. And that's the fundamental lesson that we have learned in South Africa. We have also understood, as we went to interfaith services against apartheid, and we're not speaking about ones in which you have a peaceful discourse like that, like we're having here. It is when the police are outside, when they're shooting tear gas into your interfaith service because they recognize that the church, the mosque, and the temple are the only places for the free expression of who we are as human beings, and therefore places of great danger to the well-being of the apartheid state. It is when you are able, within that context, to see not that you are trying to convince each other or to get into a comparative analysis of Quran, Judaism, of the Quran and the Torah and the Bible and so forth. But you are fighting literally to salvage the common good that all religions have. Only when you face that danger, when faith itself is at stake, you begin to understand that your interpretation of faith and so forth may have to take a second place to the preservation of faith itself, because it is under siege. And sometimes the ease of believing is the greatest barrier to believing. Sometimes it is the danger of belief that causes you to find the common ties which bind with the Desmond Tutus, with the Rabbi Franklins, and with the Swami Sharadananda. It is then that things become academic. The details of your rituals become academic. It is important for you because in that resides your identity. That's what makes you a Muslim amongst everyone else. But what binds you is the common faith that you have in the face of enormous danger. And so, what we've understood out of that is that in South Africa we were not necessarily divided by being Muslim, Christian, Hindu, or Jew. Because we found that there were Muslim fundamentalists who were very comfortable with Christian fundamentalists and who were very comfortable with Jewish fundamentalists. They were united. We found that the official clergy of Islam was very comfortable with the Orthodox clergy of Christianity and very comfortable with the Orthodox clergy of Judaism and Hinduism. Around them were united a passivity sometimes, an inability to go beyond the imitation, the inability to understand what do we do in the face of apartheid. It was only those who sought what I would call the Aqaba in order to avoid the usage of the words modernists, progressives, politicos, and so forth, but using from Surah Balad the idea that there are two paths offered to us. One is the Aqaba, the steep path. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْأَقَبَةُ. And how can Allah describe to us what is this Aqaba, the steep path? And then we begin to understand that this is the counter-instinctive path. And how do we get onto it? And so we began to understand that it is those struggling for the Aqaba, the steep path, in all of the various religions that were finding themselves in the streets against apartheid, in the churches against apartheid, in the synagogues against apartheid. That context that we began to understand, and I end up with a few key insights that I think has shaped the Muslim community arising from treading on the common path with others who are also in search of the Aqaba. The first one I've said already, that what you demand as a minority, you've got to advocate for where you are a majority. The second one is, unpalatable as it may be to some of us, that the rights you want as a Muslim, you should be willing to give to others even if you detest their lifestyles. Because when you open the door of discrimination to anyone else, you open it for yourself. The third one, that you've got to understand that your fundamental identity is being a Muslim. But it is not to the exclusion of other identities like being a South African Muslim. You can make Muslim the noun. You can make South African the adjective. You can be a South African Muslim of Malay origin or Indian origin, whatever, and eat the curry and the biryanis. And you can even have other identities that relate to sports teams, like being a supporter of Manchester United. But you can manage many identities if you understand your fundamental one. That you've got to understand what is the difference when you are given the space to believe in, to believe and to worship. What is the differential between demanding the maximalist interpretation of Islam and demanding the minimalist one? If modesty is what you want as a Muslim, does the veil go with it? Where are you making a minimalist demand, and where are you making the maximalist demand? And those are the everyday negotiations that go on. And that, I hope, are some of the things, with no minutes left, that I hope the elegance has left what I've said, but the provocation will lead not to your negative judgment of what I've said. I would say it a lot more elegantly, but that it would make you think a little bit about some of these things. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Good morning, thank you. I have a tough act to follow with Professor Sun and Ambassador, so I will do my best in the next 12 minutes to present a few ideas of what I think are key issues on religious practice and religious freedom in the post-Arab Spring. First, I'd like to thank ISNA and the Center for putting this presentation together. This is a very important debate we're having. The way I want to frame my conversation is that before I do speak about quote-unquote minorities, I do want to recall something that was a debate again in 1994, 1993, and how it relates to this very discussion. So a lot of it is to recall what Muslims are experiencing here as minorities and see if there's any comparison to the minority question in the Middle East and post-Arab Spring and elsewhere. Many of you may recall, and maybe not, but there was a very heated debate for a long time, most of the 80s, the early 90s, especially thrusted by the North American Fiqh Council, on what should Muslim Americans do in terms of assimilating? What are the obligations, the moral obligations? Is it Islamic to patronize the Democrats or Republicans? Is it fair to participate in politics? How far do you go with NGOs and civic organizations? How much is in this assimilation do you lose your Islamic identity and so forth? And there were two major scholars here in the States at that time, Taha Jabir al-Alwani and I think a visiting scholar from Syria, Sheikh Saeed Ramadan al-Bouti, who both really put these major issues and challenges for Muslim minorities. And using this fiqh al-aqaliyat, this jurisprudence for minorities, Muslim minorities. I'm not here to recall all the debates, but I think it's somewhat interesting because the same sort of idea of minorities is being used through this lens overseas. Not applied to Muslims, but to minorities, at least within the Islamic discourse. And in the end, basically, if I can say, the Cliff Notes version of this debate was really just a very, very thorough debate on how much do you sacrifice in not losing your Islamic identity, what are your obligations, what is the public good. When you participate as a Muslim American, are you participating in the public good, or are you doing harm to your community and so forth? I think that debate is long gone, and I think we see Muslim Americans in almost every sector in the United States and in North America, every sector possible. But I think what we are missing, and if we can learn from that debate, is that when we do speak about these issues on minorities, our first entree, our first encounter is through the legalistic, Sharia-based discussions. I think that we fail to think about the limitations of starting a conversation about law or jurisprudence and the history of it, or the various interpretations of it. We fail to recognize all the other perspectives that come in thinking about Islamic civilization as minorities and as Muslim majority nations. And I think by starting with that, we fail to forget that there are all these other approaches. And I think that's an issue. That's my probably biggest point. And I think we see an important paradox, because when I speak about, when I'm here is to really discuss my experiences with quote-unquote minorities, again, Christians, Mazdians, Sabians, Hindus, and so forth in Muslim-majority countries. And again, the question comes up all the time, well, what does the Islamic discourse say? What is the Sharia about this? And then we have discussions of maqasid. I have no problems about maqasid and so forth. But, and hifz ad-din, the protection of religion, the protection of their rights, the protection and so forth. But the truth of the subject is, many of the folks from these communities don't care. They don't care about maqasid Sharia. They don't care about Islamic fiqh, and they don't care about the centuries and centuries of various interpretations. What they do care is the protection of their community, and how religious political parties and the rhetoric of Islamic revivalism or Islamic politics is impacting their community, favorably within themselves and also of antagonistic parties. They do care about the Islamic resurgence, and they do listen to Ghanouchi's concepts of Islamic secularism. And they listen to the Salafis on Noor Party, and they listen to other parties and other scholars from Saudi Arabia as well as Indonesia. And they think about how to navigate through all these different conversations. Who has the authority? Who is legitimate in all of these conversations? This is a major concern. Whether you're sitting in Cairo or Lebanon, and even Morocco and so forth, you are concerned about, of all of these debates, which one's legitimate and which one's going to win out and make an impact on my life. So I think it's important that as much as I am interested, and I've studied internal Islamic ethical debates, and as much as that's rewarding in many intellectual levels, and as much as it's very nice to study proofs and argumentations and persuasions, and to study who wins and who has won and who's not, and what are the different interpretations, I don't think this should be the baseline in talking and discussing, understanding the minority experience in Muslim-majority countries. I think they have rested since independence on liberal secularism, whatever that means for these countries. They rested and really put the security on the paradox of these liberal secular societies, really despotic societies, tyrannical tyrants, and monarchies, to hold an order that their tradition, whether it be Christianity, Mazdian, Sabian, Hindu, whatever, or all the forms of Christianity, right, Eastern and Western, new movements, as well as non-religious and non-belief, that their civic and citizenship is protected. They want to be seen not as minorities. This is, again, repeated over and over in my research and experience. They don't want to be seen as minorities. For them, minorities, as someone has said, is not legitimate. It feels to them less than. They feel less than, reduced to a number, reduced to a sort of imagined community. The Christians think this way. The Maronites think this way. The Hindus think this way in the Gulf. And they are very in my discussions, defensive about this very term. Now, I'm not here to outline each of their religious freedoms issues. I think the International Commission outlines this in the annual report. But I do want to talk about sort of the discussions I've had and what are they sensing in this post-Arab Spring and changes. And that's one of that the minority, the concept of minority, the understanding of a minority needs to be altered, that the language of it itself has to be altered, and it has to be removed from the discourse of fiqh. 2 or 3, one of the things I hear is this movement of seeing them or seeing themselves within identity politics, with the thrust of various religious groups in politics, and the thrust of religious groups in, of course, in social welfare and humanitarian group and work and so forth. There's a sense that I feel, or I am assumed to act this way. I will vote as a Christian this way. I will act this way. And so they think this identity politics is also projects an imagined community that doesn't exist. I think what we're hearing over and over again is the reliance or returning to the concept as a citizen and their rights as a citizen and not as a religious group. This is some of the conversations. The other things that worry them greatly, if you move a little more east in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, is laws that already are used and abused and misappropriated. The hudud laws, the blasphemy laws. We know the governor of Punjab was killed just for looking and thinking about revisiting what's his function. We know other political figures were assassinated by talking about the hudud laws. So I think we have laws where the minorities, again, quote unquote, view, at least in Christians in Pakistan, view these laws as a way to subordinate them, to suppress their views, and also to abuse their standing, that they've been accused of many things, but not saying things. As of today, I think in Pakistan, there are 60,000 cases of blasphemy laws that's still on the docket. Again, people use that and abuse that all the time, and so this is an important situation. The other issue we find, in my few minutes left here, is that since last year, we find many Christian communities, Egypt and Tunisia, as well as the atheist community and so forth, contesting this notion that Islam has to be written in the Constitution. And they think, why is it that religious groups need to insert their religion as an approved sole religion in the Constitution? Why does it need to be stated? It's the primary religion. Why does it need to say the president must be a Muslim? Why does this do that? And what it does to many of my in my interviews is that it creates, again, reinforces the minority culture, an in-group versus an out-group, an in-group that has total access to political institutions and all of its benefits of participating, and an out-group. And I think I think they're saying is a social psychological experience of being an out-group. When the Constitution, a new Constitution that's being discussed and debated by various groups and parties, by civil society members, points to one religion, irrespective of all the other traditions and other folks who don't believe, it's been said over and over again that this is not the Constitution that they're looking for. A Constitution that should not exist because it's based on the foundations of not liberal secular democracies, and it's not inclusive. And if you claim this is the Islam you believe in, this is not the Islam I understand. This is what the interviews say. I think what we need to recall is how much of Sharia, although it's significantly important in any religious and non-religious debates, how much of it does it dominate the discussions of democracy and religious freedom and human rights and so forth? And I think we need to think of the new secular liberal democracies as a civic power that needs to be complemented as a positive quality of belief. it's a part of an experience, underlying certainties in which they are grounded. And I think, as Talal Asad has made very clear in his work, that a secular is not opposite of the religious experience. The secular is not opposite or contradictory to a religious tradition, but rather it supports the point of view of beliefs and doubts, and it brings a certainty of secular actual experiences. It has a lot to do with people being less religious as also being religious. It tells a story of some things that are sometimes ignored. I think we need to think and remind these new experiences in the post-Arab Spring that maybe if we can step back, just as we're trying to step back, and I was looking at what was happening as Muslims in the United States, maybe we need to think about the Renaissance period in Europe. Just step back and do some comparative studies. And there's a French scholar, Lucien Fabre, who said that the Renaissance in Europe was so steeply in every aspect, intellectual ones, were so saturated with Christianity, with the Christian experience and culture, all its forms of Christianity, not just Western Christianity. But it was simply, there's no space outside but to include it in the Renaissance. And I think this is, it's reasonable to think about the lessons learned from history and how that can be applied to a Renaissance or thinking about a new thinking of majority-minority relations in the Middle East and North African region. Thank you. I'm short of time, and I look forward to answering your questions.